Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight's story is The Sage's Apprentice. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. The morning air held that particular dampness that comes after rain, when the earth breathes out moisture and everything seems softer somehow, more alive. I had woken to my mother's voice calling about mushrooms, about dinner, about how the night's rain would have brought them up in the clearing near the old tower. I dressed slowly, feeling the chill of autumn settling into the cottage, and made my way downstairs where my father sat by the fire, already lost in some small repair work. My mother pressed the woven basket into my hands and reminded me to look for the pale ones, the ones with the slight purple tinge beneath the cap, good for stewing. I nodded and stepped out into the grey light of morning, feeling the wet grass soak through my boots almost immediately. The village was quiet, just a few trails of smoke rising from chimneys. I walked the familiar path eastward, toward the forest edge, where the old stone tower stood among the trees like a weathered finger. The tower had always been there, or at least longer than anyone could remember. The sage lived within it, a man whose name I knew but rarely spoke. He had helped my grandmother once with some tincture that eased the pain in her joints. My father had gone to him for spectacles, carefully ground glass that let him see his work clearly again. The village trusted him in that cautious way people trust those who know things they do not. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, all sodden from the rain. I moved carefully, eyes scanning for mushroom caps pushing through the debris. The air smelled of decay and growth intertwined, that strange perfume of autumn. I found a few common ones first, sturdy and brown, and placed them in the basket. Further in, where the trees grew closer and the light turned greenish, I spotted what I was looking for, a cluster of pale mushrooms with faint purple undersides growing in a neat circle around an old oak. I knelt down, brushing aside wet leaves, and had just closed my fingers around the first stem when the ground moved beneath me. Not violently, but unmistakably, a tremor that ran through the soil and up into my bones. I froze, waiting for it to happen again. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling, just the faint drip of water from leaves above. Then it came again, stronger, enough to make me lose my balance slightly. I stood quickly, basket forgotten, and looked around. The tower was visible through the trees perhaps 50 paces ahead, its weathered walls covered in climbing vines and moss. Without quite deciding to, I found myself walking toward it. If the sage had been conducting some experiment, if something had gone wrong, surely someone should check. That was what I told myself, though truthfully I was simply curious. The door stood slightly ajar. I hesitated before calling out, my voice sounding thin in the stillness. No answer. I called again and pushed the door open further, peering into the dimness. The interior was a single circular room, larger than expected, lined with shelves and tables covered in glass vessels, dried plants hanging from the ceiling, books stacked in precarious towers. In the centre, standing beside a table with a clay bowl of water, was the sage himself. He looked up as I entered, his face showing intense focus rather than surprise. He was older than my father, grey-haired and lean, dressed in a faded robe. His hands were stained with various colours and trembled slightly as he gestured for me to come closer. I stepped inside, suddenly aware I was intruding on something. He asked if I had felt it, the tremor. I nodded, explaining I had been foraging nearby, that I had come to make certain he was well. He smiled briefly and told me he was more than well. He was successful. The word hung weighted in the air. He turned back to the bowl, and I watched as he held his hands over it. Fingers spread, concentration settling over his features. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the water began to move. It was not a ripple from wind or vibration. The water rose in the center, forming a perfect sphere that lifted free from the container and hung suspended between his hands. It held that impossible shape for perhaps 10 heartbeats, then dropped back into the bowl with a splash that seemed too loud. The sage lowered his hands, looking at me with triumph. He began to explain, words tumbling over each other, about years of study, about patterns in the natural world, about forces beyond what the eye could see. He spoke of discovering how to reach those forces, how to bend them through focus and will. Magic, he called it, though he said the word uncertainly, as if language had not caught up with what he had found. I must have looked skeptical, because he laughed and asked what I had come for. I remembered the basket and told him about the mushrooms. He asked me to retrieve one. I went back out, gathered the basket, and brought it inside, selecting one of the pale specimens and holding it out. He took it carefully, examining it, then cupped it in both hands, that same focus settling over him. I watched as the mushroom began to change. Subtle at first, a slight swelling, then unmistakably larger, the cap expanding, the stem thickening, until what had been the size of my palm needed both hands to hold. It was perhaps 5 times its original size, perfect in proportion. The sage opened his hands and I took it, feeling the weight, undeniable proof that what I had witnessed was real. He explained he had only recently learned to control the magnitude, that before he could make things grow only slightly, but through practice he had found the focus that allowed greater change. He looked at me with intensity and said he wanted to teach me. I found myself asking why. He said that magic should not die with him, that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved, and that I had shown concern for a stranger when the earth shook, but he would need materials, certain things to create preparations that would allow someone new to sense what he had learned to sense. I asked what kind of materials. He moved to a table, producing parchment covered in cramped handwriting, a list of items both common and obscure. Herbs from the river, clay from the coastal cliffs, water from a specific spring, minerals to trade for, fish scales, roots that appeared after first frost. It would take perhaps 10 days to gather everything properly. I looked at the list, then at the mushroom I still held, and felt something shift inside me. I told him I would return, that I would bring what he needed. He nodded as if he had expected nothing else. I left the tower, stepping back into grey afternoon light with the enormous mushroom cradled in my basket. The walk home felt different, as if the boundary between possible and impossible had become thinner. I thought about water hanging in air, about mushrooms swelling beyond natural size, about an old man who claimed to have found something that might reshape everything. When I arrived home, my mother saw the mushroom before she saw me, her eyes widening, hands reaching out to touch it. She called for my father, and he came, his expression moving from curiosity to disbelief to wonder. I explained what had happened, leaving out nothing. My mother's amazement was pure delight. My father's skepticism showed in the set of his jaw, but he was practical above all, and he could not deny the evidence in our basket. They knew the sage, trusted him as the village did, and when I told them he wanted to teach me, they did not forbid it. My mother asked if it was safe. I told her honestly I did not know, but believed he meant no harm. My father asked what it would require, and I showed him the list, explaining about the 10 days. He read through it slowly, then nodded, saying the farm could spare me, that knowledge was worth seeking. We ate dinner with the enormous mushroom as our centerpiece, its flesh firm and flavorful, enough to feed us all with portions left over. As I lay in bed that night listening to familiar sounds of the cottage settling, I thought about tomorrow, about the first item on the sage's list, about stepping into something I did not yet understand, but could no longer ignore. I woke before dawn, the sky still dark beyond my window, and dressed quietly so as not to wake my parents. The first item on the sage's list was specific: silverweed root, found along the riverbank where the water ran slow and the soil stayed soft even in dry weather. It grew in patches, the sage had explained yesterday before I left, with leaves that resembled feathers and small yellow flowers. Though this late in the season, the flowers would be gone and I would need to recognize it by leaf alone. He needed the roots whole and clean, at least a dozen of good size. The air outside was cold enough to make my breath visible, and I pulled my cloak tighter as I made my way through the sleeping village. A dog barked once from somewhere distant, then fell silent. The path to the river was familiar, one I had walked countless times for water or fish, or simply to escape the closeness of the cottage on hot summer days. This morning it felt different, invested with purpose beyond the ordinary. I carried a small spade my father had left by the door and a cloth sack for whatever I found. The river appeared through the trees as the sky began to lighten, a ribbon of dark water reflecting the deep blue of approaching dawn. I could hear it before I saw it, that constant whisper of current over stones, a sound so familiar it had become almost invisible to my awareness. The bank was muddy from the recent rain, my boots sinking slightly with each step as I moved downstream looking for the slow sections where silverweed might grow. Mist hung over the water in thin sheets, drifting and reforming as I walked. I found the first patch where the river widened into a shallow pool, the current barely moving, the bank thick with vegetation that grew down to the water's edge. The leaves were distinctive once I knew what to look for. Grey-green and serrated, growing in rosettes close to the ground. I knelt in the mud, setting the spade aside, and began to dig carefully with my hands, working my fingers into the soft earth around the plant. The roots came away cleanly, pale and finger-thick, smelling of earth and something faintly bitter. I brushed the worst of the soil away and placed them in the sack, then moved along the bank searching for more. The work was slow and meditative, requiring attention but not thought, leaving my mind free to wander. I found myself thinking about the water sphere I had witnessed, trying to understand what I had seen. The sage had spoken of forces beyond sight, of patterns and focus, but these were just words that pointed at something without truly explaining it. How did thought become action at a distance? How did will reshape matter? The questions felt too large for my understanding, but I could not stop turning them over, examining them from different angles, like stones pulled from the river. By the time the sun had properly risen, casting long shadows through the trees, I had collected 15 good roots, and twice that many smaller ones that might still prove useful. My hands were black with mud, my knees soaked through, but the sack held weight and the morning felt successful. I cleaned the roots in the river water, watching the current carry away clouds of brown, then wrapped them carefully in damp cloth to keep them fresh for the journey back to the tower. The sage was awake when I arrived, as if he had been expecting me at precisely this hour. He examined the roots carefully, nodding approval, then laid them out on a wooden board to dry in a specific arrangement that seemed important, though I could not guess why. He worked in silence, and I did not interrupt, content to watch and learn what I could from observation. When he finished, he turned to me and explained that each material had properties beyond the obvious, resonances that aligned with different aspects of what he was learning to manipulate. Silverweed connected to growth and water, to the flow of energy through living systems. Combined with other elements, it would form part of the preparation I would eventually consume. He showed me the next items on the list, explaining where I might find them and what to look for. Tomorrow I would need to travel to the village market to trade for minerals the sage could not gather himself. Specific salts and powdered stones that merchants brought from distant places. He gave me a small purse of coins and detailed descriptions, warning me that some traders would try to substitute inferior materials, and I should test them as he taught me. The lesson that followed involved colour and texture, weight and smell, ways of distinguishing genuine substances from clever forgeries. I tried to commit everything to memory, knowing I would need to recall it clearly when surrounded by the noise and distraction of the market. Before I left, he asked if I had felt anything unusual since touching the enlarged mushroom, any sensations or changes in perception. I thought carefully before answering, wanting to be truthful rather than telling him what he might want to hear. There had been moments, I admitted, when the boundary between myself and the world around me seemed less solid than before, when I could almost sense the life in growing things as a kind of warmth or pressure against my awareness. But these were subtle impressions, easily dismissed as imagination, or the heightened attention that comes from looking for something. The sage nodded as if this was expected and said that sensitivity often preceded ability, that awareness was the first step toward influence. The potion I would eventually drink was not truly magical in itself, he explained, but rather a key that would help me recognize what was already present, capacities that existed dormant in everyone but rarely awakened. Magic was perhaps less about gaining new power than about learning to use senses and abilities that had atrophied from disuse and disbelief. The explanation felt both illuminating and frustrating, answering some questions while raising others. I walked home slowly, thinking about dormant capacities and awakened senses, about the difference between seeing and perceiving. The forest around me seemed more present than usual, each tree distinct and individual, each bird call clear and specific. I wondered if this heightened awareness was genuine or simply the result of expecting to notice more. The mind creating patterns because it had been told to look for them. The uncertainty did not trouble me as much as I thought it might. There was something appealing about not knowing, about standing at the edge of understanding with the possibility of insight still ahead. My mother was working in the garden when I returned, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the hard frost came. She asked how the morning had gone, and I told her about the silverweed, about the sage's approval, about tomorrow's trip to the market. She listened while continuing to work, her hands moving steadily through the familiar task, and when I finished, she said simply that I seemed different somehow, more focused perhaps, or more present. I asked what she meant, but she could not explain it better, only that she noticed a change, and it did not worry her. That evening, I studied the descriptions the sage had given me, memorizing the specific characteristics of each mineral I would need to acquire. Salt from the northern mines, white as snow and fine as flour. Crushed stone from the red cliffs, coarse and iron-rich. Black sand that held tiny flakes of metal within it. Each had particular properties that contributed to the whole, though the sage had not explained exactly how they would be used or combined. I trusted that understanding would come in time, that each day's task was building towards something coherent, even if I could not yet see the complete pattern. Before sleep, I stood at my window looking out at the darkened village, at the scattered lights from other cottages, at the forest beyond where the sage's tower stood invisible among the trees. Somewhere in that tower, an old man was working through the night, studying and experimenting, pushing at the boundaries of what was thought possible. And tomorrow I would take another step toward joining him in that work, toward learning to see what he had learned to see, to touch what he had learned to touch. The thought brought a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that felt clean and alive, and I carried it with me down into sleep. The market day began with the usual chaos of vendors setting up their stalls, shouting to each other across the square, arranging goods in displays meant to catch the eye and loosen the purse. I arrived early, while the sun was still low and the shadows long, wanting to examine what was available before the crowds made movement difficult and thinking unclear. The sage's purse hung heavy at my belt, the coins inside representing more money than I typically carried, and I kept one hand near it as I moved through the growing press of people. The mineral traders set up along the eastern edge of the square, where the light was best for examining their wares. There were 3 I could see, each with tables covered in small bowls and cloth bags containing powders and crystals and substances I could not immediately name. I approached the first cautiously, trying to appear more knowledgeable than I felt, and asked to see northern salt. The merchant, a thin man with quick eyes, produced a bowl of white powder that looked convincing enough, but when I took a pinch and rubbed it between my fingers, as the sage had taught me, it felt too coarse, the grains irregular and slightly grey when examined closely. I shook my head and moved to the next stall, where a woman with sun-darkened skin and silver hair watched me with an expression of faint amusement. She seemed to recognise that I knew enough to be dangerous to careless merchants, and when I asked for the same item, she brought out a different bowl, finer and more uniform. I performed the same test, feeling the texture, bringing a few grains to my tongue to taste the pure, clean sharpness the sage had described. This was correct, and I nodded, asking the price. She named a figure that seemed high, but not unreasonable, and I counted out the coins carefully, watching as she measured the salt into a small cloth bag and tied it closed. The red cliffstone was easier to find, several merchants carrying it, though again the quality varied. Some had mixed it with common clay to increase volume, the colour too uniform and the weight too light. I found what I needed at the third stall, a young man who seemed genuinely knowledgeable about his goods and answered my questions without the defensiveness that suggested deception. The crushed stone had the right coarseness, the right variation in shade from rust to deep crimson, and when I wet a pinch with spit, it left the characteristic stain on my fingers that indicated high iron content. The black sand proved most difficult. The first 2 merchants I asked claimed not to carry it, and the third tried to sell me ordinary dark sand from a river mouth. Nothing special about it except colour. I was beginning to worry I might not find it when I noticed an older merchant at the far end of the row, his stall smaller and less organised than the others, covered in what appeared to be random geological curiosities rather than carefully sorted trade goods. I approached and described what I needed, and he disappeared into the back of his stall, returning with a leather pouch that he opened carefully. The sand inside was genuinely black, not just dark brown or grey, and when he poured a small amount into my palm, I could see the tiny metallic flakes catching the light, gold and silver mixed together like stars in a night sky. I asked where it came from, and he told me about a beach far to the north, where black rock met the sea, and waves ground it down over centuries into this fine dark powder. The price was higher than I had expected, taking most of my remaining coins, but I knew it was what the sage needed, and I could not return without it. With all 3 materials secured in my pack, I left the market, relieved to escape the noise and press of bodies. The walk back toward the tower took me through the village, and I found myself noticing things I usually passed without attention. The way morning light fell through a particular window, casting coloured shadows from bottles on the sill. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer, rhythmic and purposeful, shaping heated iron into something useful. A child laughing somewhere out of sight, pure and unself-conscious. Everything felt more vivid somehow, more present, as if a film I had not known existed had been partially lifted from my perception. The sage was working in his garden when I arrived, a small plot behind the tower where he grew medicinal herbs and plants whose uses I could only guess at. He straightened when he saw me, dirt on his hands and knees, and gestured for me to follow him inside. I laid out the 3 pouches on his work table, and he examined each carefully, testing them with methods similar to those he had taught me, but with greater precision and confidence. After several minutes he looked up and nodded approval, telling me I had chosen well, that these were pure and properly prepared. He began to explain what would happen next, how these minerals would be combined with the silverweed roots and other ingredients still to be gathered, ground and mixed and heated in specific sequences that mattered in ways he was still learning to understand. The process was part chemistry and part something else, he said, a blending of physical properties with intentional focus that created results neither could achieve alone. I listened carefully, trying to follow explanations that danced at the edge of my comprehension, using words in ways that felt both familiar and strange. Before I left, he asked me to sit and be still, to simply observe, without trying to change anything. He moved to his work table and picked up a clay cup, empty and unremarkable, and held it cupped in both hands. I watched as he closed his eyes and his breathing slowed, becoming deep and regular. For a long moment nothing happened, and then I felt it, a change in the air itself, a tension or presence that had not been there before. The cup began to glow faintly, a warm light that seemed to come from within the clay rather than reflecting off its surface, gentle as candlelight, but unmistakably real. The glow lasted perhaps 20 heartbeats before fading, and when it was gone the sage opened his eyes and set the cup down, his hands trembling slightly. He explained that he had been practicing this, learning to move energy into objects, to make visible what was normally invisible. It was exhausting, he said, required concentration that left him drained, but it was proof that matter and energy were not as separate as they appeared. That intention could bridge the gap between them. I asked if I would learn to do this, and he said perhaps that different people had different capacities, that the potion would reveal what was possible for me, but could not create abilities that had no foundation. The conversation turned to tomorrow's task, which would take me to the coast where the sage needed clay from a specific location, a place where fresh water met salt water, and the mixing created soil with particular properties. He drew a rough map showing landmarks I should follow, a half-day's walk each direction if I moved steadily. I should bring a good container, he said, something that would not contaminate the clay, and I should gather it at low tide when the richest deposits were exposed. He warned me the path was not well travelled and I should be careful, especially near the cliff edges where erosion made footing uncertain. I walked home in the afternoon light, thinking about glowing clay and energy made visible, about the difference between what was possible and what was probable. My father was repairing fence posts when I arrived, and I helped him finish the work, enjoying the simple physical nature of it, the clear relationship between effort and result. We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from familiarity and mutual respect, and when we finished he asked how my day had gone. I told him about the market, about finding the right materials, and he listened while coiling rope with practiced efficiency. That evening, I prepared for tomorrow's longer journey, packing food and water, finding a clay pot with a tight lid that would keep the soil fresh and uncontaminated. My mother asked if I would be safe travelling alone, and I assured her the path was known and I would be careful. She packed extra food anyway, the way mothers do, and reminded me to watch the time so I would not be walking back in darkness. I promised I would, meaning it, knowing that worry was how she showed love, and that dismissing it would hurt more than the brief constraint of promises. Before sleep, I sat at my window again, looking out at the night and thinking about tomorrow's coast, about clay formed where fresh water met salt, about the mixing of elements to create something new. The sage's words about dormant capacities returned to me, the idea that magic was less about gaining power than about awakening what already existed. If that was true, then perhaps everyone carried these possibilities within them, unrecognized and unused, waiting for the right key or catalyst or moment of understanding. The thought was both humbling and exciting, suggesting that transformation was not reserved for the special or chosen, but available to anyone willing to look clearly and work patiently. I carried that thought down into sleep, where it mixed with dreams of glowing clay and water hanging impossible in air. I left before sunrise, wanting to reach the coast and return before dark. The path led east through farmland that gave way to scrubland, then to the rocky terrain that marked the approach to the cliffs. My pack held the sealed pot, food, water, and the sage's map, though the directions were simple enough: follow the stream until it met the sea, then walk north along the shore until I found the place where clay showed red against grey stone. The morning was cold and clear, frost crunching under my boots until the sun rose high enough to melt it. I walked steadily, falling into the rhythm that makes long distances manageable, the body moving while the mind drifts. I thought about the materials gathering in the sage's tower, each one chosen for properties I barely understood, building towards something that would supposedly awaken dormant senses. The idea still felt half impossible despite everything I had witnessed. The stream appeared mid-morning, a narrow band of water cutting through increasingly rocky ground. I followed it downstream, watching it grow as smaller tributaries joined, until I could hear the ocean ahead, a constant low rumble distinct from the stream's higher voice. The land opened suddenly, and there it was, grey water stretching to the horizon, waves breaking white against dark stone. The stream met it in a small delta, spreading across sand and mud before disappearing into the larger body. I turned north as instructed, walking along the shoreline where the tide had retreated, leaving behind kelp and shells and the smell of salt and decay. The cliffs rose to my left, weathered and layered, showing the compressed history of countless years in bands of different coloured stone. I was looking for red clay exposed where fresh water seeped through the cliff face, and I found it perhaps half an hour's walk from where I had first reached the coast. The clay was exactly as the sage had described, a rich red-brown deposit where a spring emerged from the rock and ran down to the sea. The water kept it soft and workable, distinct from the grey stone surrounding it. I knelt and began to fill my pot, scooping carefully, trying to avoid contamination from other soil. The clay was smooth and cool, staining my hands the colour of rust. I worked slowly, making sure to gather only the purest material, remembering the sage's warnings about quality. When the pot was full, I sealed it carefully and rinsed my hands in the spring water. The tide was beginning to turn, waves reaching slightly higher with each cycle, and I knew I should start back, but I sat for a moment on a flat rock, eating some of the food my mother had packed, watching the water move in its endless rhythm. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the repetition that was never quite identical, each wave unique while following the same pattern as countless others before it. I found myself trying to sense what the sage claimed existed beneath the surface of things, the forces and energies that connected everything. If I quieted my mind and simply observed, could I feel what he felt, see what he saw? For a moment something shifted, a perception of the water not as separate from myself, but as part of a larger whole that included me. The rocks, the sky, all of it moving together in patterns too vast to comprehend fully. Then the moment passed, and I was just a young man sitting on a rock, tired and cold, with a long walk home ahead. The journey back passed more quickly, perhaps because I knew the way now, or perhaps because I was eager to deliver what I had gathered. The sun was low but not yet setting when I reached the tower. The sage examined the clay with clear satisfaction, explaining that this particular mixture of minerals, formed where different waters met, held properties essential to the preparation. He was closer now, he said, perhaps 3 more days of gathering, and then the work of combining and refining could begin. He showed me what would be needed next. Specific fish scales from a species that came close to shore only in late autumn, roots of a plant that grew in graveyards, and morning dew collected before sunrise from leaves of the oldest oak I could find. Each item had its purpose. Each contributed something necessary to the whole. I listened to his instructions carefully, committing details to memory, already planning how I would approach each task. Before I left, he performed another demonstration, this time with a small stone. He held it between his palms and closed his eyes, and I watched as the stone began to warm, a glow of heat I could see distorting the air around it, though the stone itself showed no sign of fire. When he opened his hands, the stone was hot enough to make water hiss and steam when he dropped it in a bowl. He explained that this was energy transfer, learning to move heat from one place to another through focused intention, a principle that would become important when I began my own practice. I walked home in the gathering dusk, tired but satisfied with the day's work. My parents were finishing their evening meal when I arrived, and my mother set out a plate for me without comment, used by now to my irregular hours. I ate while my father talked about the farm, about preparations for winter, about ordinary concerns that felt grounding after a day spent thinking about forces beyond the visible. When he asked about my journey, I told him about the coast, about finding the clay, and he nodded as if this was no stranger than any other errand. That night I lay in bed thinking about the stone glowing with transferred heat, about water that moved as if alive, about a mushroom that grew 5 times its natural size. The sage's magic was not the dramatic sorcery of old stories, all lightning and transformation. It was subtler, working with what existed rather than creating from nothing, encouraging and directing rather than commanding. Perhaps that was why it felt real in a way that stories never had, because it respected the nature of things rather than violating it. Tomorrow I would need to rise early to collect dew before the sun could evaporate it, and the day after I would go to the fishing docks to find the scales the sage required. The work continued, each day building on the last, and I could feel something changing in me, though I could not have named what exactly. Awareness, perhaps, or attention, or simply the willingness to believe that more was possible than I had previously imagined. I fell asleep thinking about old oaks and morning dew, about fish that came to shore with the changing season, about all the small specific things that somehow added up to magic. I woke in darkness, knowing from the depth of the silence that it was still several hours before dawn. The dew collection required this early rising, gathering moisture that formed in the coldest part of night before sun or wind could claim it. I dressed quietly and took a wide-mouthed jar from the kitchen, then slipped out into air so cold it burned in my lungs. The oldest oak stood at the edge of the forest, a tree so massive it must have been ancient when the village was first built. Its lower branches spread wide enough to shelter a dozen people, and even now in late autumn it held more leaves than the younger trees around it. I approached carefully in the darkness, using the faint starlight to avoid roots that bulged from the ground like sleeping serpents. Each leaf held a perfect bead of moisture at its tip, trembling but not yet falling. I moved beneath the canopy and began collecting, tilting leaves gently to let the droplets fall into my jar. The work required patience and a steady hand. Too rough and the water would scatter. Too slow and dawn would come before I had gathered enough. My fingers went numb quickly, but I continued, leaf after leaf, watching the jar slowly fill with water so clear it seemed to hold light within it. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, I had perhaps half a jar, enough according to the sage's instructions. I sealed it carefully and started back, my hands aching as warmth returned to them. The village was beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of animals being tended. I went straight to the tower rather than home, knowing the dew should be delivered fresh. The sage was already awake, grinding something in a stone mortar with methodical circular motions. He examined the dew with approval, holding the jar up to the growing light, explaining that water collected this way held a purity that other sources lacked, untouched by earth or human hands until the moment of gathering. It would form the base liquid in which other ingredients dissolved, carrying their properties without adding contamination of its own. He told me that today I should go to the fishing docks and look for a man named Thomas who brought in the deep water catch. The fish I needed was called silverside for the reflective scales along its flank, and it only came near shore when the water temperature dropped in autumn. Thomas would know if any had been caught recently. I should ask for scales from the freshest fish possible, at least 20 of good size, and the sage gave me coins to pay whatever price was asked. The docks were active when I arrived, boats returning from early morning fishing, men sorting catches into baskets while gulls wheeled overhead calling their harsh cries. I asked for Thomas and was directed to a weathered man working alone at the far end of the dock, older than my father and brown as leather from years of sun and wind. I explained what I needed, and he studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. He had 3 silversides from this morning's catch, he said. Beautiful fish, still firm and fresh. He would give me the scales I needed, but I would have to remove them myself. He was too busy with the rest of the catch. He showed me to a cleaning table and brought the fish, each one perhaps as long as my forearm, their scales catching light like mirrors. He demonstrated the technique, using a blunt knife to scrape scales away from the flesh, working from tail to head. The scales came free in shimmering clusters, and I collected them carefully, counting to make sure I had enough. The work was messy, and my hands were soon covered in slime and tiny scales that stuck to skin, but there was something satisfying about it, the simple physical task that required attention but not deep thought. When I had 30 good scales, Thomas nodded approval and refused payment, saying that anyone learning from the sage was doing important work and he would not charge for such a small thing. I thanked him and wrapped the scales carefully in cloth, then washed my hands in seawater before starting back toward the tower. The sage was pleased with the quality of the scales, their size and intact condition. He explained that scales held patterns of growth, concentric rings that recorded the fish's life, and these patterns resonated with similar patterns in other living things. Combined correctly with other materials, they would help attune my awareness to the flow of life energy, the current that moved through all things though most never learned to perceive it. He asked me to stay and watch while he began preparing some of the gathered materials. I sat on a stool in the corner while he worked, moving between table and shelf and a small fire where water heated in a copper pot. He ground the silverweed roots to powder using the mortar and pestle, then added precise amounts of the northern salt, mixing them together while speaking quietly, though whether to me or to himself or to the materials I could not determine. The process seemed part careful measurement and part intuition, following steps he had clearly practiced many times while remaining alert to subtle variations that might require adjustment. He worked with complete focus, and I found myself falling into a similar state, watching without analysing, simply observing the movements and transformations as materials changed from separate elements into something unified. After perhaps an hour, he stopped and stepped back, looking at a small vial of pale powder with evident satisfaction. This was one component, he explained, that would eventually combine with others to create the preparation I would consume. Each piece had to be made separately and stored carefully, then brought together at the proper time in the proper sequence. The work could not be rushed. Each stage needed time to stabilize before the next could begin. He sent me home then, saying tomorrow's task would be more difficult and I should rest. I needed to find a plant called ghost root that grew only in old graveyards, emerging in autumn from soil enriched by what had returned to earth. It was rare and not easy to identify, requiring careful observation and a willingness to spend time among the dead. He gave me a detailed description and drawing and told me to go to the oldest cemetery I knew of, where the graves were ancient enough that the soil had fully transformed. I walked home thinking about patterns in fish scales, about powder made from roots and salt, about the patience required to do work that could not be hurried. My mother was working at her loom when I arrived, and I sat nearby while she worked, watching the shuttle pass back and forth, the pattern emerging thread by thread. She asked if I was well, and I told her I was, perhaps better than I had been, though I could not explain exactly why. That evening, my father and I repaired a section of roof that had been leaking, working by fading light to secure thatch that had come loose in recent winds. The work was straightforward, requiring coordination and steady hands, and we completed it just as full darkness fell. Inside, the cottage felt warm and safe, and I was grateful for both the strangeness of what I was learning and the familiarity of home to return to. Before sleep, I studied the sage's drawing of ghost root, memorizing the distinctive three-lobed leaves and the pale stem that grew from a bulbous root. The oldest graveyard was perhaps an hour's walk to the south, a quiet place where stones leaned at angles and names had worn to illegibility. I would go there tomorrow and search carefully, respectfully, for a plant that grew from death and contributed somehow to awakening. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead felt appropriate, a recognition that endings and beginnings were part of the same cycle. That transformation required both what was and what might become. The old graveyard sat on a hillside south of the village, surrounded by a low stone wall that had crumbled in places where frost and roots had worked their patient destruction. I arrived mid-morning with a small digging tool and cloth bag, pushing open the rusted iron gate that hung crooked on its hinges. The place was silent except for wind moving through the few trees that grew among the graves, their branches mostly bare now, reaching toward grey sky. The oldest section lay at the far end where the ground rose highest, stones so weathered their inscriptions had faded to shadows and suggestions. Some had fallen completely, lying flat among tall grass that would not be cut again until spring. I moved among them carefully, reading what names I could, finding dates from 200 years past, 300, some so old they predated the current calendar system and meant nothing to me. I began searching systematically, working in a grid pattern, examining the base of each stone and the soil around it. Ghost root would be emerging now if it was going to appear at all, pushing up through the enriched earth, where organic matter had slowly transformed into something new. The sage had explained that the plant fed on what remained, drawing nutrients but also something less tangible, some quality or essence that made it valuable for preparations meant to bridge the living and the forces that animated life. The first hour yielded nothing. I found mushrooms and common weeds, moss growing thick on the north faces of stones, but no sign of the distinctive three-lobed leaves I was searching for. I worked patiently, refusing to rush, understanding that some things could not be hurried no matter how much I might want to find what I sought. The dead had time, the stones seemed to say, and so should I. Near a cluster of small markers, children's graves by their size, I found the first specimen. It was exactly as the drawing had shown, 3 pale green leaves arranged in a triangle around a stem, so white it seemed to glow against the dark soil. I knelt carefully and began digging around it, working the tool in gently to avoid damaging the root. The bulb came free after several minutes of patient excavation, round and segmented like a small onion, with hair-fine rootlets extending from its base. I wrapped it in damp cloth and continued searching, finding 2 more plants within the next half hour, both near graves that looked to be at least a century old. The sage had asked for 3 good specimens, and I had them, but something made me continue looking, some sense that I should not leave this place until I had given it proper time and attention. The graveyard deserved respect, and hurrying felt like a form of disrespect to those who rested here. I sat on a fallen stone and let my mind quiet, simply being present among the graves. The wind moved through grass and around stones, creating sounds that were almost but not quite like voices. I thought about all the people buried here, their lives and hopes and fears, everything they had been reduced now to bones and markers, and slowly fading memory. It should have been melancholy, but instead felt peaceful, a reminder that life was temporary and therefore precious, that the time I had should be used with intention. As I sat, something shifted in my perception, similar to what I had felt briefly at the coast. The graveyard seemed less like a place of ending and more like a place of transformation, where one form became another in the endless cycle of matter and energy. The people buried here had returned to soil that now fed grass and trees and plants, their substance continuing in different forms. Nothing was truly lost, only changed, and perhaps that was what the sage's magic was really about, learning to recognize and work with these transformations rather than resisting or fearing them. I left the graveyard carefully, closing the gate behind me, though it would not latch properly, and walked back toward the tower. The sage examined the ghost root closely, approving of the size and condition of the bulbs. He explained that he would need to process these quickly, that their properties degraded if not preserved properly, and he set to work immediately, slicing the bulbs thin and laying them out to dry in a specific pattern on a wooden frame. While he worked, I asked about the nature of what he was discovering, whether magic was something external that he was learning to access or something internal that he was learning to recognize. He paused in his cutting and considered the question carefully before answering. Both, he said, and neither. The division between internal and external was perhaps less absolute than it appeared. Consciousness and matter were aspects of the same underlying reality, and magic was learning to work at the level where they met and influenced each other. The explanation was abstract, and I struggled to grasp it fully, but I thought I understood the essential point. What he called magic was not supernatural, but rather natural at a deeper level than ordinary perception revealed, working with principles that existed whether anyone knew them or not. Learning magic was like learning to see colours that had always been there, but which my eyes had not been trained to detect. He told me that tomorrow I would need to go mining, or at least digging in a place where miners had once worked. There was an abandoned quarry half a day's walk to the north, where a particular type of crystal could sometimes be found. Clear stones with a slight blue tint that formed in seams of white rock. I would need at least 3 pieces, each roughly the size of my thumb, intact and unclouded. The sage gave me a small hammer and chisel, along with careful instructions on how to extract crystals without shattering them. I walked home in the afternoon thinking about transformation and the false boundary between inner and outer, between self and world. If the sage was right, then perhaps awareness itself was a kind of tool, something that could be refined and focused to interact with reality in ways that seemed impossible only because they were unfamiliar. The thought was both exciting and slightly unsettling, suggesting that the world was far stranger and more malleable than I had been taught to believe. My mother was preserving the last of the autumn apples when I arrived, slicing them thin and laying them out to dry. I helped her finish the work, the repetitive task leaving my mind free to wander. She asked what I had done today, and I told her about the graveyard, about finding the ghost route among the old graves. She was quiet for a moment before saying that her grandmother was buried there, in the oldest section, and that it pleased her to know I had been careful and respectful in that place. That evening, I prepared my pack for tomorrow's longer journey, including food for the day and the tools the sage had provided. My father asked about the quarry and warned me to be careful, that old workings could be unstable, that I should watch for loose rock and not venture too deep into any tunnels or shafts. I promised I would be cautious, understanding that his warnings came from care rather than doubt. Before sleep, I stood at my window looking north toward where the quarry waited, invisible in darkness and distance. Tomorrow I would search for crystals in abandoned stone, looking for something that held specific properties the sage needed for his preparations. Each task built on the last, each material adding to a collection that would somehow transform into something that could awaken dormant senses. The logic of it was still beyond me, but I trusted the process, trusted that understanding would come through doing rather than through thinking alone. I fell asleep planning routes and trying to remember everything the sage had told me about identifying the right type of crystal. My dreams filled with blue light shining through clear stone. The quarry had been abandoned for decades, my father told me over breakfast, closed when the good stone ran out, and the cost of cutting deeper exceeded the value of what remained. The walk north took me through rolling hills where farms gave way to rougher country, land too steep or rocky for cultivation. I followed a track that had once been a proper road, wide enough for carts, now overgrown and broken by weather and neglect. The quarry opened suddenly as I crested a ridge, a vast bite taken from the hillside, exposing layers of stone in shades of grey and white. The working face rose perhaps 50 feet, showing where men had cut away rock in horizontal shelves. Each level stepped back from the one below. At the bottom lay scattered debris, broken stone and rusted tools, the remnants of abandoned industry slowly being reclaimed by moss and small plants that found purchase in cracks. I descended carefully, testing each foothold, aware of my father's warnings about instability. The quarry floor was uneven, scattered with fragments ranging from pebbles to boulders too large to move. I began searching the exposed faces where white stone showed most clearly, looking for the telltale blue tint the sage had described. The crystals formed in seams, he had explained, places where mineral-rich water had once flowed through cracks and deposited its dissolved cargo grain by grain over unimaginable time. The first hour of searching taught me that finding the right stone required patience and a kind of visual calibration, learning to distinguish between true blue tint and tricks of shadow or reflection. I examined dozens of white rocks that showed promise from a distance but proved ordinary upon closer inspection. The hammer and chisel hung unused at my belt while I developed the skill of seeing what was actually there rather than what I hoped to find. I found the first crystal in a seam running horizontally across the working face at chest height. A vein of white stone shot through with hairline cracks that caught light and split it into subtle colours. Embedded in this matrix were several crystals, the largest about the right size, showing that distinctive pale blue. When I angled it toward the weak autumn sun, I positioned the chisel carefully and tapped with the hammer, trying to free the stone without shattering it. The work required delicate force, a contradiction that took several attempts to understand, and my first tries either did nothing or sent cracks splintering through the crystal. The fourth attempt succeeded, the crystal coming free intact, a piece roughly the length of my thumb and half as thick, six-sided and clear except for that faint blue tint that seemed to intensify when I held it up to light. I wrapped it carefully in cloth and continued searching, knowing I needed at least two more. The second crystal took longer to find, hidden in a shadowed section where a shelf of rock overhung the working face. I had to wedge myself into an awkward position to reach it, working blind by feel as much as sight, trusting the chisel to find the right angle. When it finally came free, I nearly dropped it in my relief, catching it against my chest and backing out carefully from the confined space. The sun had passed its height and was declining westward when I found the third and largest crystal, this one exposed in a boulder that had broken free and rolled to the quarry floor. It was embedded deep but positioned perfectly for extraction, and I worked carefully, taking my time, refusing to rush despite growing awareness that I had a long walk home. The crystal emerged cleanly, larger than the others, and exceptionally clear, the blue tint visible even without holding it to light. I had what I needed, but something made me pause before leaving, some sense that I should take a moment to acknowledge this place. The quarry represented years of human labour, men working stone day after day, cutting and hauling and shaping, their effort creating the opening that had allowed me to find what I sought. There was a kind of accidental collaboration across time, their purpose enabling mine though they could never have known what would come after. I climbed back out as afternoon turned toward evening, moving carefully with the added weight of crystals in my pack. The walk home seemed longer than the morning journey, fatigue accumulating with each mile, but I maintained steady pace and reached the tower just as the sun touched the horizon. The sage examined the crystals with evident pleasure, holding each one to the fading light, nodding approval at their size and clarity. He explained that crystals like these could hold and focus energy in ways that most materials could not, their ordered internal structure creating properties that would become important in the final stages of preparation. These particular stones, formed slowly in darkness and pressure, carried a resonance that aligned with intention, helping to amplify and direct the subtle forces he was learning to manipulate. He would need to cleanse them first, washing away surface contamination, then charge them through a process he was still perfecting before they could be incorporated into the whole. Tomorrow would be different, he said. Rather than gathering materials, I would begin learning techniques of focus and awareness that would prepare me for the moment when I finally consumed the preparation. He asked me to arrive early and to eat lightly, to come with my mind as clear and uncluttered as possible. The instruction made me nervous in a way the physical errands had not, suggesting I was approaching something that required more than simple effort or attention. I walked home through gathering dusk, tired in body but alert in mind, thinking about what tomorrow might bring. My parents were at supper, and I joined them, eating the stew my mother had prepared, grateful for the simple nourishment and the familiar comfort of shared food. My father asked about the quarry, and I described the abandoned workings, the search for crystals, the careful extraction. He listened with interest, seeming pleased that I had returned safely and found what I sought. That night I tried to quiet my mind as the sage had instructed, to come to tomorrow uncluttered by expectation or anxiety. It was harder than I anticipated, thoughts circling and returning despite my attempts to release them. I thought about all the materials now gathered in the sage's tower, each one chosen for specific properties, each one representing a day's work and attention. Soon they would be combined, and I would drink whatever resulted, and something would change or nothing would. And either way, I would know more than I knew now. Eventually sleep came, bringing dreams of blue light shining through clear stone, of water rising in spheres, of plants growing from enriched soil where endings became beginnings. The dreams were not troubling, but neither were they entirely peaceful, charged with anticipation and uncertainty about what lay ahead. I woke once in deep night and lay listening to the cottage sounds, the settling beams and distant owl calls. Anchoring myself in the familiar before sleep claimed me again and carried me down toward morning. I ate only bread and water for breakfast, following the sage's instruction to come with body and mind uncluttered. My mother watched with concern but said nothing, trusting that I knew what I was doing, or at least that the sage did. The walk to the tower felt different this morning, charged with significance that previous journeys had not carried. Today I would begin learning the internal practices that would prepare me to work with whatever the preparation would awaken. The sage was waiting outside when I arrived, standing in the small clearing before his tower, eyes closed and face turned toward the morning sun. He acknowledged my presence with a slight nod, but did not speak, and I understood I should remain silent as well. We stood together for several minutes, simply being present to the morning, to the light and air and sounds of the forest waking around us. It should have felt awkward, but instead felt natural, a kind of shared attention that required no words. Finally, he opened his eyes and gestured for me to follow him inside. The tower's interior had been rearranged, the usual clutter of materials pushed back to create an open space in the centre. 2 cushions sat facing each other, and he indicated I should take one while he settled onto the other. When we were both seated, he began to explain what we would be doing, speaking quietly but with precision. The preparation I would eventually drink, he said, would open pathways of perception that normally remained closed, allowing me to sense the subtle energies and forces that moved through all things. But sensation without understanding was useless or even dangerous, like giving someone the ability to see without teaching them what different sights might mean. So before I consumed anything, I needed to learn basic techniques of focus and awareness, ways of directing attention that would let me work with what I perceived rather than being overwhelmed by it. We would start with breathing, the foundation of all focused practice. He instructed me to close my eyes and simply observe my breath without trying to change it, noticing where I felt the air entering and leaving, what parts of my body moved with each cycle, how the rhythm varied or remained steady. It seemed absurdly simple, but I did as he asked, turning attention inward to something so automatic I had never really noticed it before. The first thing I discovered was how quickly my mind wandered, thoughts arising, and pulling attention away from the simple act of breathing. I would manage perhaps 3 or 4 breaths of clear observation before suddenly finding myself thinking about something else entirely, the present moment lost to planning or remembering or imagining. Each time I noticed this, I would gently return focus to the breath, beginning again, and gradually the periods of sustained attention grew longer. We sat this way for what felt like hours, though was probably less, the sage occasionally offering quiet guidance, reminding me to relax my shoulders or soften my jaw, to observe without judging, to let thoughts pass like clouds rather than engaging with them. Slowly something shifted, a quality of stillness settling over my mind that was different from simply being quiet. It was an active stillness, alert and present, aware of the breathing and the body and the room around me without being caught in thoughts about any of it. When the sage finally spoke and told me to open my eyes, I felt as though I was surfacing from deep water, returning to ordinary awareness with a sense of having been somewhere else entirely. He asked what I had noticed, and I tried to describe the quality of attention I had found, the way it felt both focused and open at the same time. He nodded, saying that this was the foundation, that everything else built on this capacity to be present without distraction, to observe without immediately interpreting or reacting. Next, he taught me a technique for sensing energy in my own body, a practice of moving attention through different areas and noticing sensations that were always present but usually ignored. He guided me through this slowly, starting with my feet and moving upward, asking me to feel warmth or tingling, pressure or lightness, any quality that distinguished one part from another. At first I felt almost nothing, but gradually subtle sensations became apparent, a kind of aliveness or vitality that flowed through flesh and bone. By midday we paused, and he brought out bread and cheese, insisting I eat properly now to rebuild strength after the morning's work. We ate in silence, and I found myself noticing the food differently, the texture and taste more vivid than usual, as if the practice of focused attention had sharpened all my senses. After eating, we rested briefly, then continued with a different exercise, this one involving sensing energy beyond my own body. He placed a small plant on the table between us, a common herb in a clay pot, and asked me to extend the quality of awareness I had been developing inward toward this external living thing. I should not try to think about the plant, but rather feel it, sense it as I had learned to sense my own body, noticing what arose in awareness without forcing or fabricating anything. I closed my eyes and directed attention toward where I knew the plant sat, and after several minutes of nothing, I began to perceive something, a subtle presence or vitality that seemed to emanate from the living thing. It was faint, and I could not be certain I was not imagining it, but the sage encouraged me to trust what I perceived, to practice distinguishing between genuine sensation and wishful thinking through repeated observation. The difference, he said, was consistency and clarity. Genuine perception remained stable when examined, while imagination tended to shift and change based on expectation. We spent the rest of the afternoon working with this, me attempting to sense the plant, while he occasionally moved it or replaced it with different objects, testing whether I could distinguish living from non-living, healthy from wilting. My accuracy was perhaps slightly better than random chance, enough to suggest something real, but not enough to be certain. The sage seemed unconcerned, saying that development took time, that I was learning to use senses that had been dormant my entire life and could not expect mastery in a single day. What mattered was establishing the foundational practices and beginning to open the pathways that the preparation would later amplify. As the afternoon faded toward evening, he told me that tomorrow would bring the final material gathering, a task both simple and significant. I needed to collect my own blood, just a small amount, drawn at dawn and brought to him fresh. This would be the final component, he explained, the element that would attune the entire preparation specifically to me, making it personal rather than general, a key shaped to fit one particular lock. He showed me how to make a small clean cut on my forearm, how to collect the blood in a vial without contamination, how to bind the wound properly afterwards. The instruction was matter of fact, and I tried to receive it the same way, though the idea of deliberately cutting myself carried a psychological weight that gathering plants or stones had not. He assured me it would be painless if done correctly, that the body was resilient and a small wound would heal quickly. I walked home as dusk settled, my mind still partly in the quiet focused state I had practiced all day. The world seemed more present somehow. Colours and sounds and the feeling of air against my skin, all slightly more vivid than usual. I wondered if this was what the sage experienced constantly, this heightened awareness of everything around him, and whether I would come to live this way as well. My parents were working by lamplight when I arrived, my father mending harness and my mother sewing. I sat with them quietly, content to be in their presence without needing to talk. Eventually my mother asked if I was well, and I told her I was, that today had been different from the previous days, but good in its own way. She seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to her work, and we sat together in comfortable silence until it was time for sleep. That night I practiced the breathing technique the sage had taught, lying in my bed and observing each breath, letting my mind settle into stillness. Sleep came easily from this state, and my dreams were calm and formless, just a sense of floating in peaceful darkness. I woke once before dawn and lay listening to the pre-morning quiet, knowing that today I would provide the final piece of what the sage needed, and that after today the work would shift from gathering to preparation, from collecting materials to combining them into something that might change everything I understood about the world and my place in it. I woke before dawn and sat at the edge of my bed, preparing myself mentally for what needed to be done. The small blade the sage had given me lay on the table beside a clean vial, both waiting in the darkness. I lit a candle and studied my forearm in the flickering light, finding the spot he had indicated, where the flesh was soft and away from major vessels. The cut needed to be quick and clean. Hesitation would only make it worse. I steadied my arm against the table and drew the blade across skin in one smooth motion. The sting was sharp but brief, more surprising than painful, and blood welled immediately, darker than I expected in the candlelight. I positioned the vial beneath the wound and let it flow, watching the level rise slowly, the blood warm against glass. When I had perhaps 2 fingers' depth, I pressed cloth against the wound and held pressure as instructed, feeling my pulse throb against the fabric. After a minute I checked and found the bleeding had nearly stopped, just a slow seep that would cease on its own. I bound the wound with clean linen, wrapping it carefully to keep the cut clean and protected. The vial I sealed with a cork stopper, then wrapped it in cloth to keep it warm. The sage had emphasized that the blood should be as fresh as possible, still carrying the warmth and vitality of the living body. I dressed quickly and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, that deep blue that comes before true sunrise. The world felt hushed and expectant, caught in that strange time between night and day when everything seems suspended between states. I walked quickly, my breath visible in the cold air, wanting to deliver the blood while it retained whatever quality made it valuable for the sage's purpose. The tower showed a light in its window, the sage already awake and working. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been listening for my approach. He took the vial immediately, unwrapping it and holding it up to his lamp, examining the colour and clarity with an expert eye. He seemed satisfied and gestured for me to enter, moving immediately to his work table where various vessels and materials were arranged in precise order. I watched as he added the blood to a clay bowl containing liquid that looked like water, but moved strangely, thicker somehow, catching light in unusual ways. The blood dispersed through it in swirling patterns that seemed too organised to be random, forming spirals and curves that held their shape longer than they should before finally dissolving into uniform red-brown colour. The sage watched this process intently, occasionally tilting the bowl to observe from different angles, his expression focused and thoughtful. He explained that all the materials were now gathered and he would spend today combining them according to a sequence he had developed through careful experimentation. Each element needed to be added at a specific time and in a specific state, some heated, some cooled, some ground to powder, while others remained whole. The process could not be rushed or interrupted. Certain stages required precise timing, and he needed to work without distraction to ensure everything came together properly. He asked me to return tomorrow at midday and to come prepared to stay through the afternoon and evening. Tomorrow I would drink the preparation, and we would spend the remaining daylight hours working with whatever it revealed, learning to direct and focus the awakened senses before they faded or became overwhelming. His tone was calm but serious, and I understood that we were approaching something significant, a threshold that once crossed could not be uncrossed. I asked if there was anything I should do to prepare, any way I should spend the day that would help with what was coming. He considered this carefully before answering. I should stay calm, he said, avoid anything that would agitate my mind or body. Light meals, gentle activity, time spent in quiet observation of the natural world. I should practice the breathing and awareness techniques he had taught me, reinforcing those skills so they would be readily available when needed. And I should think carefully about my intention, about why I wanted to learn this, and what I hoped to do with the knowledge. I left him to his work and walked home through the growing morning light, thinking about intention and purpose. Why did I want to learn magic? The question was harder to answer than it seemed. Curiosity, certainly, and the desire to understand something that had been hidden. But beyond that, I realized there was a sense that this knowledge mattered, that it represented a way of engaging with the world that was more direct and honest than the half-asleep way most people moved through their days. The sage had awakened something in me simply by demonstrating that more was possible, and now I could not return to comfortable ignorance even if I wanted to. The village was fully awake when I arrived home, people going about their morning tasks, and I felt oddly separate from it all, as if I was already becoming something different from what I had been. The feeling was not unpleasant, but it was strange, a sense of standing between two worlds, without fully belonging to either. I wondered if the sage felt this way constantly, isolated by knowledge that others did not share, and whether learning magic meant accepting a certain amount of separation from ordinary life. My mother noticed the bandage when I came inside and asked what had happened. I explained about the blood, the final material needed, and she examined the wound with a critical eye before pronouncing it clean and well tended. She asked if I was nervous about tomorrow, and I admitted I was, though perhaps excited more than afraid. She said that was natural, that stepping into the unknown always brought both emotions mixed together, and that she trusted I was doing what was right for me. Her acceptance meant more than I could easily express, and I felt grateful to have parents who supported, rather than hindered, what I was attempting. The day passed slowly, time stretching in that particular way it does when waiting for something significant. I helped my father with farm work, repairing a section of fence where animals had pushed through, and the physical labour was welcome, giving my body something to do while my mind circled endlessly around tomorrow. We worked mostly in silence, the steady rhythm of posts and rails requiring coordination but not conversation, and I found the simplicity of it grounding. In the afternoon I walked alone to the forest edge and sat beneath the old oak where I had collected dew days earlier. I practiced the breathing technique, letting my mind settle into stillness, then extended awareness outward as the sage had taught me, trying to sense the life in the tree, in the soil, in the small creatures moving through the undergrowth. The perceptions were faint and uncertain, but I thought I could feel something, a kind of vitality or presence that connected all living things in patterns I was just beginning to recognize. As I sat there, I thought about the 10 days that had passed, each one bringing a new task, a new material, a new piece of understanding. The work had seemed mundane at times, simple errands of gathering and trading, but looking back, I could see how each day had built on the last, how the physical tasks had been teaching me patience and attention while the materials accumulated in the sage's tower. Nothing had been wasted. Everything had contributed to bringing me to this moment of readiness. That evening, my parents seemed to sense the importance of what was coming, and my mother made a special meal, better than our usual fare, as if marking an occasion. We ate together slowly, savouring the food and the companionship, and afterward my father told stories from his youth, tales I had heard before, but welcomed hearing again, their familiarity comforting against the uncertainty of tomorrow. My mother added her own memories, and for a while we sat together in the warmth of shared history, connected by bonds that went deeper than words. Before sleep I sat at my window and looked towards where the tower stood invisible in darkness. Somewhere in that stone structure, the sage was working through the night, combining materials gathered over 10 days, transforming them through processes I barely understood into something that would supposedly awaken capacities I had never known I possessed. The whole thing still felt half impossible despite everything I had witnessed, and yet I could not deny that something real was happening, that the world was stranger and more malleable than I had been taught. I lay down and practiced the breathing technique one last time, letting my mind settle into stillness. From that quiet place, I tried to sense what tomorrow might bring, but nothing came clearly, just a feeling of potential, of standing at a doorway with no way to know what lay beyond, except to step through and discover. The uncertainty should have troubled me, but instead felt appropriate, a recognition that real transformation required releasing control and trusting the process, even when the destination remained unknown. Sleep came eventually, carrying me down into quiet darkness, and I rested deeply, gathering strength for whatever the next day would bring. I arrived at the tower precisely at midday, the sun standing directly overhead in a sky that had cleared to pale blue. The sage was waiting outside, and I noticed immediately that he looked tired, his eyes shadowed from working through the night, but there was also something else in his expression, a kind of quiet satisfaction that suggested the work had gone well. He gestured for me to come inside without speaking, and I followed him into the dimness of the tower. The interior had been transformed. Most of the usual clutter had been cleared away, leaving the central space open except for a simple wooden chair and a small table. On the table sat a clay cup filled with liquid that appeared perfectly clear, like water, but somehow more luminous, catching light in ways that seemed subtly wrong, or perhaps subtly right in ways I had never noticed before. The sage indicated I should sit, and he took a position standing beside the table, one hand resting lightly near the cup. He began to explain what would happen, speaking slowly and carefully, as if he wanted to be certain I understood every word. The preparation I was about to drink contained all the materials we had gathered over the past 10 days, combined and refined through processes that aligned their properties and amplified their effects. The liquid itself was mostly the dew I had collected, purified and charged with energy through techniques he had developed. Dissolved within it were essences extracted from the other materials, concentrated and harmonized into a unified whole. When I drank it, he said, I would begin to feel effects within minutes. The first sensation would likely be a warmth spreading through my body, followed by a heightened awareness of my own physical presence. Then gradually, my perception would begin to shift, allowing me to sense things that had always been there, but which I had lacked the capacity to detect. These sensations might be overwhelming at first, which was why he would guide me through the experience, helping me learn to focus and direct what I perceived rather than being swept away by it. The effects would last several hours, he explained, gradually fading as my body processed and integrated what the preparation had awakened. But even after the immediate effects wore off, something would remain changed. Pathways that had opened would not close completely. Capacities that had awakened would not return entirely to sleep. I would retain some ability to sense and work with the subtle energies around me, though it would require practice and dedication to develop these abilities further. He asked if I had any questions, and I found I did not. Everything that could be explained in words had been explained, and the rest would only become clear through direct experience. I told him I was ready, and he nodded, lifting the cup and holding it out to me. I took it carefully, feeling the smoothness of the clay, the slight warmth of the liquid within. I raised it to my lips and drank, taking it all in 3 steady swallows. The taste was strange, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, slightly sweet and slightly bitter with an earthy undertone that reminded me of forests after rain. I set the empty cup down and waited, my heart beating faster with anticipation. For perhaps a minute nothing happened, and I wondered if the preparation had failed, if all the gathering and combining had been for nothing. Then I felt it, exactly as the sage had described, a warmth beginning in my stomach and spreading outward through my chest and limbs. The warmth intensified, becoming almost uncomfortable, and I started to speak, but the sage gestured for silence, his expression calm and reassuring. The sensation peaked and then stabilized, settling into a steady glow that seemed to illuminate my body from within. I became acutely aware of my heartbeat, my breathing, the flow of blood through veins, the firing of nerves carrying signals between flesh and brain. It was not painful, but it was intense, overwhelming in its detail and immediacy. Then my awareness began to expand beyond the boundaries of my skin. I could sense the sage standing beside me, not just seeing him, but feeling his presence as a warmth and solidity, a pattern of energy that was distinctly human and distinctly him. I could sense the table, the chair, the stone walls of the tower, each one present in a way that went beyond simple physical location. Everything seemed to pulse with a kind of life or vitality, even objects I knew were not alive in the usual sense. The sage's voice came as if from a great distance, telling me to breathe, to use the techniques he had taught me to anchor my awareness. I focused on my breath, feeling it move in and out, and the overwhelming flood of sensation became more manageable, organized into something I could observe rather than being lost in. He guided me through the process of directing attention, showing me how to focus on specific things rather than trying to perceive everything at once. He asked me to sense the plant he had placed on the table days ago, when teaching me awareness exercises. I turned my attention toward it, and the perception that had been faint and uncertain before now blazed clearly, the life force of the small herb, vivid and unmistakable. I could feel it drawing energy from soil and light, transforming these into growth and maintenance, a process both mechanical and miraculous. The sage asked me to extend my hand toward it, to try directing energy from myself into the plant, encouraging its growth. I held my palm above the leaves and focused my intention, imagining warmth and vitality flowing from my hand into the living thing below. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then I felt something shift, a current moving through me and out through my extended hand. The plant's leaves trembled slightly, and I thought I saw them darken, becoming more deeply green, though I could not be certain if this was real or imagined. The sage told me to stop, and I withdrew my hand, feeling suddenly exhausted, as if I had been running. He explained that what I had just done was the beginning, the first crude attempt at directing energy with intention. It would become easier and more controlled with practice, but I should not push too hard too quickly. The work was demanding and could drain me if I was not careful. He had me rest for several minutes, focusing again on breathing, letting my energy replenish. We spent the next hours working through various exercises, the sage teaching me to sense different types of energy, to distinguish between living and non-living, between healthy and diseased, between active and dormant. He showed me how to draw energy from the earth beneath my feet, how to release excess energy safely rather than letting it build uncomfortably. He taught me basic techniques for shielding myself from overwhelming input, creating boundaries that let me choose what to perceive rather than being open to everything constantly. As afternoon faded toward evening, the intensity of the preparation's effects began to diminish, the overwhelming clarity slowly receding towards something more sustainable. The sage explained that this was normal, that the initial opening was temporary, but that I had now established pathways that would remain accessible with practice. He gave me exercises to perform daily, ways of maintaining and strengthening the capacities I had awakened, warnings about pushing too hard or attempting things beyond my current ability. When full darkness had fallen and I was steady enough to walk safely, he accompanied me partway home, wanting to ensure I was truly stable before letting me continue alone. We walked in silence through the forest, and I found I could sense the life around us even in darkness. Trees and small creatures and insects all present as patterns of warmth and movement. The world had become richer, more layered, full of information I had been blind to my entire life. At the forest edge, he stopped and told me I should rest tomorrow, let my body and mind integrate what had happened. The day after I could return, and we would continue my education, building on what I had begun to learn. He asked how I felt, and I tried to find words for the experience but failed, finally just saying that everything had changed, and I could not go back to seeing the world as I had before. He smiled and said that was exactly right, that I had crossed a threshold and there was only forward now, deeper into understanding and capability. I walked the last distance home alone, seeing my village with new eyes. I could sense the sleeping families in their cottages, the animals in their pens, the crops dormant in fields waiting for spring. Everything connected, everything part of patterns that flowed and shifted, and I was part of it too, not separate, but woven into the same fabric of energy and matter and consciousness. The realization was humbling and exhilarating in equal measure. My parents were awake when I arrived, waiting though it was late. They looked at me with concern and curiosity, and I tried to explain what had happened, what I had learned, but the words felt inadequate. My mother asked if I was well, and I told her I was better than well, that I had discovered something profound and true. My father asked what I would do now, and I said I would continue learning, that the sage had offered to teach me, and I would accept that gift. Before sleep, I stood at my window one last time, looking out at the familiar landscape that now seemed entirely new. The sage's tower was visible as a darker shape against the night sky, and I could sense the energy within it, the man still awake and working, pursuing mysteries that might take a lifetime to fully understand. I knew that I would return there, day after day, learning what he had to teach, and perhaps discovering things neither of us had yet imagined. The journey was just beginning, and though I could not see where it would lead, I knew with certainty that I wanted to walk that path, to see how far these new capacities might take me, to explore the strange and wonderful country that had always existed just beyond ordinary perception, waiting to be discovered by anyone willing to look with new eyes and an open mind.